Welcome to Late Night Calm. Let the room go quiet now. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, and let the day, with all its small noise and hurry, begin to loosen its grip on you. There is nothing left to solve tonight. There is nothing to remember, nothing to hold, nothing you must carry from one thought to the next. You can let your eyes close whenever they wish to close. You can let the words become a kind of weather, something moving gently past you, and you do not need to follow every one. If you drift off before we reach the end, that is not a failure. That is exactly what this is for. The list will keep going without you, quietly, patiently, the way a river keeps moving past a sleeping traveller on its bank. Tonight we are going to travel somewhere very old and very far away, and yet somewhere that has never quite let go of the world you live in. We are going to Athens, the Athens of more than 2,000 years ago, in the centuries the historians call the Classical Age, the time of the great democracy and the long war, and we are going to do something the usual stories never do. We are not going to stand at the top of the marble and look down. We are going to begin at the very bottom, in the dark, and climb slowly upward, one human life at a time, until we reach the man at the summit who thought he ruled and discovered that he did not. And to make the climb, we are going to follow a single coin. Picture it in your palm, a small disc of silver, cool to the touch, heavier than you might expect for its size. On one face, the head of a goddess in a crested helmet, the goddess Athena, for whom the city is named. On the other face, an owl, round-eyed and solemn, standing beside a little sprig of olive, with 3 small letters that mean simply of the Athenians. The people who used it did not call it by a number. They called it a drachma, and the owl upon it was so trusted, so widely known, that merchants from Egypt to the shores of the Black Sea would take it without weighing it, would take it on sight, on faith, the way you might take a familiar face. These little owls flew everywhere. They were the most trusted thing the city made. But a coin does not begin as a coin. Before it is money, it is metal, and before it is metal, it is stone, and before it is stone, it is buried in the earth in the dark. So before we can spend our drachma, before it can pass from hand to hand up through every level of this strange and dazzling society, we have to go down and find the silver. We have to go to the place the coin was born. And the place the coin was born was the worst place in all of Athens to be alive. So come down with me now, gently, into the earth. This is where we begin. At the far southeastern tip of Attica, the region around the city, some 50 kilometres from the marble and the marketplaces, the land grows harsh and low and scrubby, and beneath it runs a treasure. The place is called Laurion, and Laurion was silver country. Not silver you could pick up in bright nuggets, not veins of shining metal lying open to the sun. The silver here was locked inside a heavy grey ore, a lead-bearing rock that the miners called galena, and to free the silver from the lead you had to break the rock out of the ground, and then you had to burn it, and burn it again, in a slow and poisonous process the Greeks called cupellation. You would roast the ore and blow air across it until the lead oxidized and drew off and left the precious silver gleaming behind. That was the refining. But the roasting and the blowing came later, up in the air, in the light. The finding of the ore came first, and the finding of the ore happened underground. Now I want you to imagine that underground, because it is the heart of tonight's first story, and I want you to feel it rather than simply hear it. Imagine a gallery cut into the rock, a tunnel, but not a tunnel you could walk through upright with your head held high. These galleries were narrow. Many of them were so low that a grown person could not stand up inside them at all. You worked on your side, or on your back, or crouched down small, hacking at the rock face with a short iron pick, in a space barely taller than your own body lying down. There was no daylight. There was no sky. There was only the black, and against the black, one small point of flame. That flame came from a little clay oil lamp, a shallow dish of terracotta with a wick floating in olive oil, and it gave off a light no brighter than a candle, a warm and trembling orange glow that reached perhaps an arm's length before it surrendered to the dark. And here is the detail I want you to hold, because it tells you almost everything about how these lives were counted. The lamp was not only your light, the lamp was your clock. The oil in that little dish would burn for a certain span of hours, and when the oil ran low and the flame guttered and shrank, that was the measure of your shift. Your working day was not marked by the rising and setting of a sun you could not see. It was marked by how long a dish of oil could burn in the airless dark. You worked until the lamp went out. The air down there was thin and hot. The deeper the galleries went, the harder it became to breathe, the ore dust hanging in the still air, the heat of the earth pressing in on every side. There was no comfort in any direction. And the people who did this work, who lay in the low black galleries and swung the pick by lamplight until the oil ran dry, were, almost every one of them, enslaved. This is the foundation we have to lay down first, because everything else in Athens stands upon it. The brilliant city, the voting and the debating, the theatres and the festivals, the philosophers walking in the shade talking about the good life, all of it rested upon a base of human beings who were owned by other human beings. And the silver mines of Laurion were where that ownership showed its cruelest face. To be sent to the mines was, in the Athenian imagination, a kind of doom. It was where you sent someone when you had given up on them entirely. It was a punishment and a death sentence dressed as labour. Free men did not do this work. The poorest citizen in Athens, as poor as he might be, did not go down into those galleries. This was the bottom, and the bottom was filled with the unfree. Let us stay here a moment quietly, without turning away, because these are the hands that dug our coin. The people who worked and lived and died in the mines were, in the law of Athens, not persons at all. They were property. The Greek word was andropoda, and it is a hard, revealing word. It was built to echo another word, the word for livestock, for four-footed property, and the enslaved were the two-footed kind. That is how the language itself filed them away, alongside the cattle and the sheep, as things that could be owned. They could be bought and sold, they could be handed on in a will, or offered as security on a loan, or leased out like a plot of land. In the worst of the mines they were marked, and they were chained, so they could not flee up the galleries toward the light. And in a court of law they had no standing of their own. An enslaved person could not bring a case, could not speak for himself as a full voice, could not stand before the jury and be believed as a citizen would be believed. His word, on its own, was worth nothing there. And yet the silver those hands dug out was worth a very great deal, and I want to show you just how much, because it changes the whole shape of the story you thought you knew. Somewhere around the year 483 before our era, the miners of Laurion struck a rich vein. A great seam of ore, a windfall of silver, more than the mines had yielded before. And a sudden fortune like that raised a question for the whole city, because by law and custom the wealth of the mines belonged in some measure to the people of Athens. What should they do with it? There was a strong and natural voice that said, "Divide it. Share it out among the citizens, a payment to every man, a little bounty from the earth." It is easy to understand that voice. It is the voice that wants the good fortune felt in every household right away. But there was another man, a clever and far-seeing and rather ruthless leader named Themistocles, and Themistocles argued for something else entirely. He looked out past the coastline of Attica across the water, and he saw the great empire of Persia gathering itself in the east, a power vaster than anything Greece could field, and he understood that it would come. So he told the Athenians to take that river of silver and not to spend it on themselves at all, but to pour it instead into ships, into warships, into a fleet. And they listened to him. The windfall from Laurion, the silver torn out of the low black galleries by chained and marked and owned human beings, was turned into a navy. Not a handful of vessels, but a true fleet, dozens upon dozens of long, lean warships, and when the Persians came at last, 3 years later, in the year 480, that fleet was waiting for them. In the narrow straits, at a place called Salamis, the Athenian ships met the enormous Persian armada and shattered it, broke the invasion in the water, and saved the city, and in a sense saved the whole idea of Greece as something free. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment, because it is the first thread in the web I want to weave for you tonight. The freedom of Athens, the survival of the very city that would go on to invent a democracy the world had never seen, was purchased with silver dug by people who had no freedom at all. The unfree, labouring in the dark, paid for the liberty of the free, who fought in the light. The coin binds the bottom of the pyramid to everything that rises above it. And the Athenians, for the most part, did not find this a contradiction. They did not lie awake troubled by it. It was simply the way the world was arranged, the way the machine was built, and they lived inside it without asking the question that seems so loud to us now. Now, who owned these people, and how did that ownership actually work in the plain arithmetic of money? Here we have a wonderful and terrible little window. Because one particular wealthy Athenian, a man named Nicias, has come down to us as an example, and his example tells you that in Athens a human being could be, quite simply, an investment. Nicias was rich, one of the richest men in the city, and according to the writer Xenophon, who set these things down, Nicias owned something on the order of 1,000 enslaved people. 1,000. Not to work in his house, of course. What does one household need with 1,000 pairs of hands? He owned them the way a man today might own a portfolio, an asset that generates a return. And what he did with them was lease them out. He rented them to the men who ran the mining operations at Laurion. And in exchange for each enslaved person he sent down into the earth, Nicias received a rent. The rent was 1 obol per slave per day. Let me hold that little coin up to the lamplight for you, because we are going to be counting in obols and drachmas all through tonight's journey, and it is worth learning the weight of them now, slowly. So the numbers later will have a texture you can feel. 6 obols made 1 drachma. So an obol was 1/6 of a drachma, a small coin, one of the little silver pieces that people would sometimes carry tucked inside their cheeks for want of a pocket, so tiny it could be lost in the folds of a hand. 1 obol a day, for 1 human life, paid not to the human being who swung the pick in the dark, but to the wealthy man who owned him and never went near the mine at all. Multiply that 1 small coin by 1,000, and every single day, without lifting a finger, Nicias took in a river of silver. an income flowing up out of the earth and out of other people's suffering and into his strongbox. The enslaved man got the labour, the darkness, the failing lamp, the thin hot air. The owner got the obol. That is what it meant, at the bottom of Athens, to be property. You were not a worker who was paid badly. You were a thing that generated a payment for someone else. How many of them were there down in Laurion at the height of it? Here we have to be honest with you in the way that good history is honest, and admit that we do not know exactly, and that anyone who gives you a single confident number is telling you more than the evidence can bear. The counting of the enslaved was not something the Athenians did carefully. The enslaved were not citizens to be enrolled, they were property to be estimated, and property is counted loosely. So the historians give us a range, and the range is wide. At its peak, the mining district of Laurion may have held something on the order of 10,000 enslaved workers, or 20,000, or 30,000, or perhaps more than that. The uncertainty is real, and we should not paper over it. But even the smallest of those figures is a crowd. Even 10,000 human beings, sent down into the low galleries to hack silver out of the rock by lamplight, is a multitude, a whole city's worth of people living and labouring in the dark beneath the shining city of the living. And there is one moment, one single event in the long war that came later, that lifts the curtain just a little and lets us glimpse how very many of the enslaved there truly were, all across Attica, not only in the mines. For that we jump forward in time, from the age of Salamis to the long and grinding war between Athens and Sparta that consumed the end of the 5th century. The war the historian Thucydides recorded with such cold and careful clarity. Late in that war, in the year 413, the Spartans did something new. Instead of marching into Athenian territory each summer to burn the crops and then marching home again, they came and they stayed. They seized and fortified a place called Decilia in the countryside of Attica, and they held it, a permanent enemy garrison sitting in the middle of Athenian land, year-round, watching the roads. And with that hostile fortress planted in the countryside, with a place to run to that the masters could not easily reach, something happened that the enslaved of Athens had surely always dreamed of in the dark. They fled. They ran. Not one or two, not a handful, but, as Thucydides tells us plainly, more than 20,000 of them deserted. More than 20,000 enslaved people slipped away from the mines and the workshops and the farms and vanished toward the enemy lines and the hope of freedom, and many of these, the historian notes, were the skilled ones, the craftsmen, the trained hands from the mines and the trades. 20,000. Let that number settle. It is one of the only hard figures we have from an Athenian's own hand for the sheer scale of the enslaved population, and it comes to us almost by accident, recorded not out of any concern for those people, but as a blow to Athens, a loss of valuable property in a time of war. But turn it over and hold it the other way, and it becomes something else. It becomes 20,000 human beings who, the very moment a door cracked open, walked through it. 20,000 who, given even the smallest chance, chose to leave everything they knew and stake their lives on the road to freedom rather than stay one more day in the galleries and the workshops of the enlightened city. Whatever the masters told themselves about the natural order of things, about how this was simply the way the world was arranged, the enslaved themselves cast a different vote with their feet on that night, and cast it by the tens of thousands. So this is the ground floor of Athens, and we have laid it down carefully, because everything we build tonight sits upon it. Down in the dark at Laurion, in galleries too low to stand in, lit by clay lamps whose failing flame measured the length of a life's day, owned human beings called by a word that meant almost the same as cattle, chained where they might run, marked where they might be lost. Voiceless in the courts, hacked the grey galena out of the earth. That ore was roasted and refined until the silver ran free of the lead, and that silver was struck into little owl-faced coins, trusted across the whole of the known world, and once, when the coin ran as a great river of unexpected wealth, a far-seeing and ruthless man turned it into ships, and those ships saved the city. And the city that was saved would go on to call itself the freest place on earth. The freedom of the few, purchased with the labour of the many, and the coin passing silently between them, carrying the debt no one acknowledged. Now our drachma has been born. It has come up out of the galleries and off the refining hearths, a bright new disk of silver with Athena on one side and her owl on the other, ready to begin its long climb through every level of this world. And as it rises, it will pass out of the mine-owned hands and into other hands, hands that are still not free, but not sent to the mines either, the hands that ground the grain and fetched the water and wove the cloth and minded the children in the houses and the workshops and the fields of the city above. For not all of the enslaved lived and died in the dark of Laurion. Most of them, in fact, lived up in the light, close enough to touch the citizens they served, inside the very homes of the free. And that closeness, that strange and intimate nearness of the own to the owner, is where we are going to travel next, up out of the earth and into the courtyard of an ordinary Athenian house, where a boy is being walked to school by a man who belongs to his father. But we are not there yet. For now, let the mine grow quiet behind us. Let the last small lamp gutter down into the dark, its work finished, its oil spent. Let the long galleries fall silent. You have gone down to the very bottom of this old world and looked upon it without flinching, and now you can let it recede, softly, the way a place seen from a boat slides away behind you as the water carries you gently on. There is nowhere you have to be, there is nothing you have to hold. The coin will keep climbing, and I will keep walking beside it, and you can come as far as you like before sleep takes you. Let your breathing slow, let the numbers and the names blur together into something gentle and unhurried, a quiet stream of a vanished world, asking nothing of you at all. We have found our silver. We have seen where it comes from. And now, slowly, patiently, with all the time in the world, we begin to carry it upward toward the light. And as we carry it, let me tell you what this silver has already done in the world, long before it became a coin small enough to rest in the palm of a hand. For the silver did not come out of the ground looking like silver at all. It came out grey and heavy and dull, locked inside a stone the miners knew as galena, a silver-bearing lead ore that gave up its treasure only slowly and only to fire. The stone was carried up out of the dark and broken and washed and roasted, and then it was refined by a patient, ancient method called cupellation, in which the ore was heated in a shallow hearth until the lead drew off and the bright metal was left behind, gleaming, at last, the way water is left behind when the sea draws back from the sand. Imagine standing over that hearth in the heat of the day, watching the grey give way to something that shone. Imagine how strange and quiet a wonder that must have seemed, that the dullest of stones could be coaxed into the brightest of metals if only enough hands and enough fire were spent upon it. And enough hands were spent. That is the whole of the matter, and the reason we lingered so long in the dark below. The silver was there in the earth, but the earth does not open itself. It has to be opened, gallery by narrow gallery. And the opening of it was done by the enslaved, in their tens of thousands, across the long southeastern reach of Attica, where the diggings ran. We do not know their number exactly, and it is right to be honest about that, because the honest thing is gentler than the false one. The old sources and the modern reckonings give us a wide and open range rather than a single hard figure, somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000, and perhaps more at the height of the work, and no one can close that range for certain now. But the very width of the uncertainty tells you something. It tells you the crowd down there was vast. So vast that even the people who lived beside it could only guess at its edges, the way you cannot count the trees in a forest you are standing inside of. And here is one of the strangest facts of that whole vanished economy, a fact to turn over slowly as the coin rises. The men who profited from those thousands of hands did not always dig, or wash, or roast, or refine. Some of them never went near the pits at all. There was a wealthy Athenian named Nicias, and it is written of him by Xenophon that he owned somewhere near 1,000 enslaved people, and that he did not set them to work himself. Instead, he leased them out, hired them to those who ran the mines, and for each enslaved man so hired, he received a rent of about 1 obol a day. Sit with that a moment, softly, the way you might turn a smooth stone over in your fingers. 1 obol a day. It is a tiny coin, one of the small ones, 6 of them to a single drachma. And it was paid not to the man who swung the pick in the low dark. It was paid to the man who owned him, up in the sunlight, for the mere fact of owning. The worker's whole day of labour, all his sweat and all his aching and all his breath in that thin hot air, became a small silver weight that dropped, evening after evening, into the purse of a man he had perhaps never seen. That was slavery in Athens, shown at its plainest. It was not only cruelty, though it was cruelty. It was also an arrangement, an investment, a way that money quietly made more money, while the men who were the money laboured in the dark and were counted like sheep. So the silver had a price written into it that no coin ever showed on its face. And yet, once it was refined and struck, this same silver went out into the world and did the largest things a city can do. There was a moment, a single lucky moment, when the diggers struck a rich new vein, and a great sudden weight of silver came up out of Laurion all at once, more than the city had ever had. This was around the year we would call 483 before our era, in the years just before the Persians came, and the city stood at a crossroads over what to do with the windfall. It could have divided the silver among the citizens, a small bright share for every free man, a gift to be spent and gone. But there was a man named Themistocles who argued for another course. He urged the Athenians to pour the silver not into their own purses, but into ships, into a fleet of triremes, into oars and timber and bronze rams, and they listened to him. The windfall from the mines became a navy. And a few years later, when the great Persian fleet came against them, it was that navy, those very ships bought with that very silver, that met the enemy in the narrow waters at Salamis and broke him there, in the year we would call 480. Imagine it. The silver that was dug in the dark by the enslaved, who had no vote and no name in any court, became the wooden wall that saved the free city. The lowest hands in Athens dug the metal that armed the ships that kept Athens free. The coin binds the bottom to everything above it, and it binds it from the very beginning, from the first great vein, before it is even a coin at all. That is the thing to carry upward with the silver, not only what it cost, but what it built, and how the two were never once separated in the life of that city. And the enslaved knew, in their own way, exactly what their labour was worth, because when the chance came to withhold it, they took it. There is a moment late in the long war with Sparta that shows this more plainly than any speech could. The Spartans came into Attica and did not simply raid and leave as they had before. They fortified a place called Deceleia and held it, a permanent thorn, a foreign fort in the Athenian countryside, in the year we would call 413. And once there was somewhere to flee to, somewhere near and held by the city's enemies, the enslaved began to slip away. Thucydides, who lived through those years, tells us that more than 20,000 slaves deserted, and that many of them were the skilled ones, the craftsmen and the mine workers, the very hands that turned stone into silver. 20,000. It is the one moment in all the long record when the invisible foundation of the city becomes, for an instant, countable, because it stood up in the dark and walked away. Imagine that quiet exodus, night after night, thousands of feet moving across the fields toward the enemy's fort, not out of love for Sparta, but out of the simple, unanswerable wish to no longer be owned. It is a rare and precious number, that 20,000, and it does two things at once. It tells us how many there were, down in the dark and the workshops, that so many could leave and the loss be felt. And it tells us what they wanted, which was the one thing the shining city withheld from them. For under the law, they were not persons at all. The Athenians had a word for them, andrapoda, and the word itself confesses the thing, for it treated a human being as a kind of livestock, as property to be bought and sold and counted and moved. An enslaved person could not stand in a court of law in his own name. He could not speak for himself before the jurors as a free man could. He could be marked so that a runaway might be known, and in the worst of the mines he could be chained, and he could be worked, quite simply, until the work was finished with him. This is the ground the whole bright pyramid stood upon, and we have stood upon it too, without turning away, and now we can rise. And yet the mines were not the only place you might find yourself if you had been born into this lowest station. They were the worst of it, the sentence that men feared most, the place spoken of in lowered voices. But slavery in Athens was wider than the mines, far wider, and it touched every corner of the city's life, from the first light of morning to the last lamp extinguished at night. Most enslaved people in Athens did not die in narrow galleries under the hills of Laurion. They woke, as you might have woken, inside a house. Think of an Athenian house of modest means, somewhere in one of the neighbourhoods that spread below the Acropolis. Mud brick walls on low stone footings, a tiled roof, rooms arranged around a small open courtyard where a little fig tree might grow and where the light came in from above. The street-facing walls were almost windowless, turned inward on themselves, private and plain. From outside you would know almost nothing of the life within. And inside, alongside the family, there might be one enslaved person, or two, or three, depending on how well the household stood. To own none at all was a mark of real poverty. It was not the exceptional household that kept enslaved workers. It was the ordinary one. In that ordinary house, before the city outside had fully shaken itself awake, water needed to be fetched. There were no pipes, no running supply piped to the door. Water came from public fountain houses, the most famous of which was called the Enneakrounos, the 9 spouts, where the water flowed from 9 stone mouths into stone troughs. and women and enslaved people came in the early morning with tall clay jars called hydriae balanced on their heads or carried by their handles. The hydria could hold perhaps 15 or 20 litres when full, and it was heavy, and the walk from the fountain to the house was a walk that happened every day, without exception. Because a household without water was a household that could not cook or clean or live. This was one of the morning's first labours, quiet and rhythmic, the soft percussion of filled jars set down on stone floors. And then the grain needed to be ground. Barley was the staple, more than wheat, and the mill was a handstone worked back and forth across a saddle quern, turning the dried grain slowly into the rough flour that would be kneaded into maza, the flat barley cake that most Athenians ate as their daily bread. It was slow work, the grinding, and it made a low, steady sound that ran through the morning alongside the smell of oil lamps and the first warmth of a small fire. The enslaved woman or man who ground the grain did not choose the work. They did it because it needed doing, and because they were there. Weaving, too, was a constant. Cloth was not bought from a factory, it was made inside the house. Wool was spun into thread at the distaff, and thread was woven on an upright loom into the chitons and himatians the family wore, into blankets and covers and the cloth used for 100 domestic purposes. This was primarily the work of women, both citizen women and enslaved, and the loom stood in the women's quarters as a kind of anchor, the piece of furniture that never moved, the work that never fully ended. A household textile was not merely a practical thing, it was proof of the household's order and virtue, visible to guests, symbolic of the woman who oversaw it. Then there was the paidagogos. Among families of even middling means, a citizen boy of school age was not simply sent out into the streets alone. He was accompanied, each morning, by an enslaved man whose job was to walk with him to his lessons, to carry his writing tablets, to sit outside while the boy learned his letters and his lyre and his gymnastics, and to bring him home again. The paidagogos was not a teacher. He was a guardian and an escort, and sometimes something closer to a companion, spending more daily hours with the child than the father did. In a house where the father was often in the agora, or the courts, or the palestra, or the assembly, the paidagogos was the constant presence in a boy's growing years. There is something in that arrangement that resists easy summary. An enslaved man entrusted with the moral supervision of a free child, walking the same streets, entering the same buildings, knowing the city's rhythms as well as anyone, and yet owning nothing, protected by nothing, able to be sold. Some enslaved people in Athens moved through the city with a degree of autonomy that would surprise those who picture only chains. The arrangement called kris oikuntes, living apart, allowed certain skilled enslaved men to operate with considerable independence. A potter, a shoemaker, a bronze caster who had acquired a craft might be permitted by his owner to rent a workshop, hire his own assistants, manage his own accounts, and keep a portion of his earnings. He paid his owner a fixed sum regularly, a payment called the apophora, and what was left after that was his to use as he chose. Some of these men, over years and years, accumulated enough from that kept surplus to purchase their own freedom. And here is a fact that opens onto something larger. Freedom bought or granted, manumission, did not make an Athenian. A freed enslaved person did not step out of bondage into citizenship. He stepped into a different, more tolerable, but still carefully bounded category. He became a metic. He joined the class of resident foreigners, the free non-citizens who lived and worked in Athens under their own set of rules and their own set of exclusions. The ceiling was real, and it was legal. Freedom and citizenship were not the same thing in Athens. They were not even close to the same thing. And understanding that distinction is what allows you to move from the bottom of the pyramid to the next step up, and to see that the next step, while immeasurably better than bondage, was still a long way from the thing that mattered most. Before we leave the enslaved entirely, one more fact settles into place like the last stone of a foundation. If you were enslaved in Athens, and you were involved in a legal case, not as a party, you had no standing as a party, but as a witness, your testimony was considered admissible by the courts only under a specific condition. That condition was torture. The procedure was called the basanos, the testing, and the theory behind it was straightforward in its grimness. An enslaved person would naturally lie to protect his master, and so truth could only be extracted under physical duress. Whether the basanos was routinely applied or frequently invoked rhetorically and rarely enacted is debated among scholars, but the rule itself stood, written into the legal system, a declaration that the word of a bound person was worth less than that of a free one, less, in fact, than what could be compelled from them in pain. That is the floor we have been standing on. Now we rise. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp, sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. The metics were free. That is the first thing and the most important thing, and it is not a small thing. They walked the streets without chains, conducted their own business, chose where to live, argued in the agora, went home to their own families at night. The difference between even the most independent enslaved craftsman and the most ordinary metic was a difference in kind, not merely in degree. One was property, the other was a person. And yet the metic's freedom was bounded on every side by what the law called disability, by the things he was not permitted to do that any citizen man could do as a matter of birthright, as a matter of simple morning habit. The word itself, metoikion, means something like one who dwells with, or one who lives alongside the citizens, that is. Beside them, but not among them, in the full legal sense. A metic was a free non-citizen resident, a Greek who had come from another city, Corinth or Megara or one of the islands, a foreigner from further away, a freed enslaved person who had bought or earned his release and now lived in Athens with his freedom intact and his political standing at zero. They clustered, the metics, in the neighbourhoods nearest trade and water, in the commercial districts, and most of all in the Piraeus, the great port that lay a few miles south of the city proper, connected to Athens by the long walls, a pair of parallel ramparts that ran from the city to the sea and enclosed the road between them. The Piraeus was a different world from the quiet residential streets below the Acropolis, a polyglot, busy, salt-smelling place of dockyards and warehouses and counting houses and taverns, shrines to foreign gods rising alongside Athenian ones, ships being loaded and unloaded and repaired, money changing hands in a dozen languages. The metic felt at home in the Piraeus because the Piraeus did not pretend to be purely Athenian. The defining disability was political, and it was total. A metic could not vote in the assembly. He could not sit as a juror in the courts. He could not hold any public office. With rare and specific exceptions, he could not own land or a house in Attica, the bedrock of the Athenian economy. The soil that rooted the citizen was legally closed to him. This last prohibition was not accidental. Land in Athens was the anchor of citizenship, its visible, tangible symbol, the thing that tied a family to the city across generations. By withholding land from metics, the law kept them perpetually mobile, perpetually contingent, unable to sink roots that might someday sprout into a claim. And because they could not own land, they went where land was not needed. Into trade, into banking, into manufacturing, into the crafts that could be practiced in a rented workshop and sold to anyone who would buy. The metics became the commercial engine of Athens, the businessmen and bankers and manufacturers, without whom the city's economy would have ground very nearly to a halt. The irony is so complete it looks almost designed. By barring metics from the one thing that grounded a citizen, Athens drove them into everything else, and everything else turned out to be where the money was. Each metic paid a poll tax called the metoikion. It was not a crippling sum, but it was a marked one, a regular and explicit reminder of the category to which you belonged. The rate was 12 drachmas a year for a metic man, 6 for an independent metic woman. 12 drachmas was roughly 12 days' wages for a skilled worker, not ruinous, but not nothing, and more importantly, unavoidable. Failure to pay the metoikion carried a severe penalty. A metic who defaulted on the tax could be sold into slavery. The tax was thus more than a revenue measure. It was a mechanism of control, a way of keeping the metic status visible and costed, a way of saying annually that your place here is permitted and conditional, not inherited and secure. Beyond the tax, a metic was required to have a citizen sponsor. The prostats was a citizen man who stood between the metic and the legal system, who represented him in the courts when legal matters arose. Because a metic could not simply appear before an Athenian jury and speak for himself as a full person the way a citizen could. He needed a citizen face, a citizen voice to introduce him to the machinery of Athenian justice. Without a prostats, a metic was legally exposed in a way that made commercial life deeply uncertain. And yet the metics took the risk. They came anyway. They stayed. Because Athens, with all its exclusions, still offered something. A stable currency. A fleet that kept the sea lanes open. A rule of law that was enforced even for non-citizens in commercial disputes. A market rich enough to make a careful man wealthy. They also bled for it. Metics were required to serve in the Athenian military. They fought as hoplites in the phalanx alongside citizen men, and they rode in the fleet alongside thetes and hired foreigners, and they died on campaign in the same foreign fields. At the great public funeral that Athens held each year for its war dead, the ceremony that Thucydides describes so carefully, the metics who had fallen were mourned alongside the citizens. Their bones came back in the same procession. Their names were spoken in the same oration. The city honoured their sacrifice in death with exactly the kind of public recognition it withheld from them in life. They could die for Athens. They could not govern it. And there were metics who became very rich indeed. Consider Cephalus. He was not an Athenian. He had come from Syracuse, and he settled in the Piraeus and built his business there, an arms manufactory, shields and weapons at a time when Athens needed them constantly. His shield workshop, we are told, employed around 120 enslaved workers. 120. This was not a cottage industry. This was one of the largest manufacturing operations in Athens, staffed entirely by enslaved people working under a free man who was himself barred from voting by the city that his products helped defend. Cephalus grew wealthy. conspicuously wealthy, the kind of wealthy that attracted both envy and respect. And it was at Cephalos's house, in the Piraeus, where Plato set the scene that opens the Republic. The dialogue begins with Socrates travelling down to the port and being invited in, and the first conversation is with old Cephalos himself, the metic arms manufacturer, sitting with a garland on his head at a sacrifice. An old man at ease in his prosperity, talking about money and justice and what a man needs at the end of his life. Plato chose that house, that man, that location for a reason. The conversation that would become one of the foundational texts of Western philosophy began in the home of a resident foreigner, in the commercial port, not in the citizen's agora or the philosopher's gymnasium. The opening of the Republic is itself a small act of recognition that the excluded built something worth entering. And then there is Passion. His story follows the path from the bottom to something extraordinary, and it deserves to be told slowly. Passion began as an enslaved person. We do not know his origin or the circumstances of his enslavement. We know that he came to be working for two bankers in Athens, Antisthenes and Archestratos, and that he was skilled and trustworthy enough that over time he was permitted increasing responsibility. Eventually, by whatever combination of ability and time and the accumulation of his master's confidence, he was freed. He became a metic, with all the freedoms and all the limitations that came with that status. And then he did something remarkable with those limits. He built one of the largest banking operations in Athens, working from the money tables in the agora, managing deposits and loans and currency exchange on a scale that made him rich enough to lend significant sums to the city itself. He was eventually granted Athenian citizenship, a rare honour, extended to him by vote of the assembly in recognition of his services to the state, which included providing money and arms in a time of need. He rose from anthropoda, from the category of livestock, to citizen. The path was real. But it was also exceptional in a way that made it feel almost like a proof of the rule's tightness, one man over a lifetime. Climbed from enslaved to free to metic to citizen, and it was remarkable precisely because it was so rare. The wall between metic and citizen was not maintained by habit alone, it was maintained by law, and the law was made deliberately tighter. In the year 451, or 450, Pericles carried a new citizenship law through the assembly that changed the definition of who could be a citizen of Athens. Before that law, a child could claim citizenship through his father alone. If the father was Athenian, the child was Athenian, regardless of the mother's origin. Pericles' law required both parents to be Athenians, both father and mother of citizen stock. A man who married a metic woman would now find that his children could not inherit his citizenship. A metic woman who bore a child with an Athenian man produced a child who was, legally, not Athenian at all. Why then? Because Athens in the middle of the 5th century was rich and powerful and drawing people from across the Greek world, and citizenship, with its assembly vote, its jury pay, its share in the surplus of empire, had become something enormously worth having. The law was the city pulling up the drawbridge at the very moment when the bridge was most tempting to cross. It made the category of citizen more exclusive, just as it made the rewards of citizenship more generous. And it underlined, in the plainest legal language, that birth was what mattered. Not virtue, not wealth, not service, not years of residence or taxes paid or wounds taken on the city's behalf. Birth, and specifically the birth of both parents, was the thing. The metics who paid their 12 drachmas a year and served in the fleet and let their sons die on the same field as citizen sons, their grandchildren were still metics. The wall did not have a door that time alone could open. This is the shape of the second and third steps of the pyramid. Then, the enslaved person in the house was not in the mine, and the mine was not all of slavery. He walked through the same rooms, sometimes raised the same children, learned the same streets. The chrysoikuntes man, with his workshop and his apophora payments, inched toward something. Toward the day, perhaps, when freedom could be purchased. And then freedom, when it came, meant metic status, which meant the 12 drachma tax and the prostat's sponsor and the ban on land and the silence in the assembly. And the metic, for all that, could become Kephalos with his 120 workers, or Passion with his banking tables, and might even, in the rarest and most exceptional of cases, find the assembly extending a hand across the wall. But the wall was always there. The city needed them. The city taxed them. The city sent them to war and mourned them afterward. The city simply would not let them in. Let your breathing settle for a moment here. There is no urgency in any of this. The facts have been waiting 2,500 years, and they will keep. Feel the weight of the blanket, if there is a blanket. Feel the particular stillness of the room at this hour. Outside, whatever the season, the night is doing what it does, and you are here, held, with nothing asked of you but to listen as long as you wish. We are moving upward through the city now, step by quiet step, toward the rowers and the soldiers and the women who ran the houses and the men who sat in judgment of their neighbours, and all of them will come to us in the same unhurried way, one at a time, one fact finding its place beside the next, the way a tide comes in. The metic quarter of the Piraeus was the first place you would find, if you wanted it, the thing that made the whole city go, money. Not the abstract idea of money, but the physical fact of it, the small, heavy disk of silver that passed from hand to hand and made every exchange legible, every debt payable, every wage countable. The money changers sat at their wooden tables, trapezai, the tables, which gives us our word for bank, in the Piraeus and in the Agora, and they tested the coins that came to them from across the Greek world and beyond, biting them, weighing them against standard weights, and exchanging foreign currencies for the currency that Athens minted. That currency bore on one face the helmeted head of Athena, and on the other her owl, the little bird of wisdom, with an olive sprig beside it and the first 3 letters of the city's name. They were called owls, the Athenian coins, and they circulated from Egypt to the Black Sea, recognized everywhere, accepted everywhere, because the silver from the mines of Laurion was reliable, and the weight was honest, and the image was known. The owl coin was the closest thing the ancient Mediterranean had to a trusted international currency, and every owl had begun, somewhere, in the dark, under the hills of southeastern Attica. The denomination most often handled in daily life was the tetradrachm, the 4 drachma coin, large enough to make substantial purchases and small enough to carry in a hand. Below it came the drachma, and below that the obol, and below the obol fractional coins, so tiny that people are recorded carrying them in their mouths for lack of any better pocket, the small warm disc pressed against the cheek. 6 obols made a drachma. 100 drachmas made a mina. 60 minas made a talent. These were the rungs of the monetary ladder, and the metic banker at his trapeza in the Piraeus sat at the centre of the ladder's middle reaches, the man through whose hands the silver passed, as it moved from the mine to the market to the treasury, and back again. Back! Again, he could not vote for the men who commanded the treasury, but he could, and did, lend money to them. And now, from the Piraeus, moving up the road between the long walls, back toward the city itself, the pyramid rises another step, and we arrive at the man who rode. But before we find him, we must linger a moment longer at the bottom of the pyramid, because the mines were not the whole of it. Slavery in Athens was not only the man with the lamp in the narrow gallery. It was also the woman grinding grain before dawn in a city kitchen. It was the child leading a citizen boy through the morning streets to his teacher. It was the skilled hand at the loom, at the forge, at the oar of a ferry. The pyramid's base was wide, and most of the people in it lived not under the hills of Laurion, but inside the walls of the city and the households of its citizens. Even a family of modest means kept an enslaved person or two. To own none at all was considered a sign of genuine poverty, a mark that placed a household near the edge. These enslaved men and women cooked and fetched water and kneaded the barley and supervised children and wove cloth on the standing loom in the courtyard. One of the most familiar figures in a citizen household was the paidagogos, an enslaved man whose work was to escort the citizen's son to school each morning, to carry the boy's writing tablets and his oil flask, to wait outside the door while the lesson went on, and to bring him home again at midday. He was not a teacher. He was a guardian, a chaperone, a daily companion, and he was property. The intimacy of that arrangement, the enslaved man who spent more hours with the citizen child than most uncles did, was simply a texture of daily life. Nobody in Athens found it remarkable. Water came from the public fountain houses, the tall stone spigots fed by clay pipes from the hillside springs. Women and enslaved people went to them in the morning with tall narrow jars called hydria balanced on the head or carried on the hip and stood in line while the water fell. It was daily, physical, repetitive work, the kind that marked your station as clearly as any legal document. Not all enslaved labour was supervised within a household. Some enslaved craftsmen worked at a greater remove from their owners. These were the chris oikuntis, those who lived apart. A skilled metal worker or a potter or a dye man might be set up in a workshop of his own, with tools and a small living space, and expected to pay his owner a fixed sum each day or each week. This payment was called the apophora, the sum brought back. Whatever the craftsman earned above the apophora was his to keep. Over years, a careful and skilled man could accumulate enough to purchase his own freedom outright, paying his owner what the market said he was worth, and walking out of the arrangement a free man. This happened. It was not common, but it happened. And it mattered, because it meant that freedom existed as a real destination at the end of a long road, though what waited at the end of that road was not what a citizen had at birth. The state itself owned enslaved people. These were the demosioi, the public slaves, and among the strangest of them were the Scythian archers, a corps of enslaved men, perhaps 300 at the height, who served as something like a public police force. They carried bows. They kept order in the assembly when the crowd grew unruly, stretching a rope dipped in red chalk across the agora to herd citizens toward the Nix Hill when the session was called. A man who dallied and arrived with red chalk on his cloak was marked, visibly, as someone who had wandered rather than come promptly. The Scythian archers also arrested those accused of serious offences and served the magistrates as attendants. They were enslaved, and they held the batons. Athens was full of these paradoxes that no Athenian found paradoxical. And there was one more layer to the legal texture of slavery that the pyramid required you to understand, if you were to understand what manumission actually meant. When an enslaved person purchased freedom or was freed by a master's choice, they did not become a citizen. They became a metic. The legal wall between enslaved and free was crossable, with effort and luck and coins saved over years. The wall between metic and citizen was not. Freedom changed your condition. It did not change your birth. And in Athens, birth was the hinge on which everything legal turned. Which brings us to the metics themselves. The word was metoikus, one who dwells with, and it named a person who was free, who paid taxes, who walked the same streets and drank from the same fountains, who might be richer than half the citizens around him, and who could not vote, could not sit on a jury, could not own land, and required a citizen to stand in front of him in any legal matter as his designated sponsor. This sponsor was called the prostats, the one who stands before, and without one a metic could not appear in a court as a full legal person. The relationship was practical, and sometimes warm, and sometimes purely transactional, like most arrangements in Athens that bridged unequal parties. The metoikion was the annual tax that marked the distinction. 12 drachmas a year for a man. 6 drachmas for an independent woman. Not a ruinous sum for a prosperous merchant, but a constant reminder that residence in Athens came at a price that citizens did not pay. Failure to pay could result in being sold into slavery. The tax said, quietly but without ambiguity, "You are here by permission, and the permission must be renewed in silver." Metics could not own land in Attica. This single disability shaped their entire economic world. Unable to invest in the thing that grounded citizen wealth, the farm, the olive grove, the vineyard, they channeled their money into the things land could not hold: trade, lending, manufacturing, craft. The Piraeus was thick with them. The agora's money tables were mostly theirs, and when Athens needed shields and spears in large quantities, it was often a metic workshop that filled the order. Kephalos was a Syracusan, a metic who had come to Athens at the invitation of Pericles and built his family into a successful arms manufacturing concern in the Piraeus. His workshop employed something in the range of 120 enslaved workers, producing shields. It was, by the standards of the ancient world, a large industrial operation, and it was in Kephalos's house, or so Plato imagined it, that Socrates and his companions sat down to talk about justice, the long conversation that became the Republic. The old man Kephalos appears only briefly at the opening before going off to make a sacrifice, leaving the philosophers to their argument. But his presence matters. The man whose house frames the most famous philosophical dialogue about the just city was a foreigner who could not vote in the city whose justice was being debated. The banker patient had started lower still. He had begun as an enslaved man, working in the banking business of his owners, and he had learned the trade with such skill and built such a reputation that he was eventually freed. He became a metic. He ran his own bank. He grew wealthy enough that Demosthenes' speeches mention him as a figure of substance. And then, at the very end of his life, the city of Athens granted him citizenship. Not as a routine matter, but as an exceptional reward for specific services rendered to the state. It happened perhaps once in a generation. It was proof that the ceiling was not absolute. It was also proof of how low the ceiling sat for almost everyone who stood beneath it. Pericles, the same man who had opened the assembly to pay and the courts to the poor, had in 451 or 450 B pushed through a law that tightened the definition of citizenship itself. From that point forward, a man was a citizen of Athens only if both his parents were Athenian citizens, not just the father. Both, a citizen man who had taken a foreign wife and fathered children with her, found those children cut off from the rolls. That law drew a quiet line through the household of every citizen who had married across its borders, and the line did not move. Athens had decided, in the generation of its greatest power, that belonging was a matter of blood and birth, and no amount of wealth, service, or years of residence could entirely dissolve that fact. The metic stood at his table in the agora, changing coins, lending money, paying his 12 drachmas of metoikion each year, serving in the fleet when the city called, and knowing that the ceremony of enfranchisement that had elevated passion once in a lifetime would not come for him. Below the metic on the city's ladder, and yet above him in a single crucial respect, there was a man who owned very little land, and sometimes none at all. He lived by his labour. He hauled timber on the docks at Piraeus. He worked a rented strip of thin Attic earth at the edge of the countryside. He bought and sold in small quantities in the agora, carried loads, mixed mortar, dug foundations. The Athenians called him a thete, and his name reached back to the classification the lawmaker Solon had drawn up more than a century before the city's classical height. Solon had divided citizens into 4 property classes based on how much grain, oil, or wine their land could produce in a year. The Pentakosiomedimnoi produced 500 measures or more and sat at the summit. The hippies, the horsemen, came next, with enough wealth to maintain a warhorse. The Zeugatai, the yokemen, held enough land to field a plough team and buy their own armour. And the thetes, the last and most numerous class, held the rest. In the old days, before the sea had changed everything, a thete had been a citizen in name while remaining at the edges of real power. He could attend the assembly and vote, but the archonships and the offices that carried real prestige had been beyond him. He served when the city went to war, but as a light skirmisher, an auxiliary, a man without the armour that marked the true citizen soldier. He was there, but he was at the margin of things. And then the fleet arrived in his life, and everything shifted. Athens built triremes, the long, narrow warships that sat low in the Aegean, moved fast on a good cruise rhythm, and struck with a bronze sheathed ram at the waterline. A single trireme carried about 170 rowers arranged in 3 tiers, one above the other, their oar handles overlapping in the narrow space of the hull. Each man on his leather cushion on a thwart that was precisely fitted to his stroke. Add a small deck crew, a flute player to keep the stroke, officers, a helmsman, and a contingent of marines, and each ship went to sea with close to 200 men. The Athenian fleet at its peak numbered in the hundreds of ships. The arithmetic of that is worth holding for a moment. Hundreds of ships, each requiring roughly 170 rowers, drawing from the poorest tier of the citizen body and from metics and hired foreigners willing to take the wages. The thetes did not supplement the fleet at its edges. They were the fleet, in the way that blood is not merely part of the body, but the thing the body runs on. And the city paid them. A rower received around 1 drachma a day in good times, dropping to perhaps 3 obols, half a drachma, when the campaign ran long and the city's war chest was thin. 3 obols would not make a man comfortable. It would buy a day's food, a loaf and some olives and a few dried figs, and not much beyond that. But it was cash, and it was steady, for months of the sailing season. And for a man without land, it meant the difference between bare survival and something that resembled a household. He was not a chained prisoner. He was not driven to his bench by a guard with a whip. The image that later centuries would embroider onto the ancient world, the galley slave, anonymous and broken, pulling an oar in darkness, was not the Athenian reality. These were free men. Citizens, metics, hired foreigners who had come to the Piraeus looking for work. They were skilled. Trireme rowing was not brutish hauling. It was disciplined, technical, precise labour. The three tiers, the thalamitai at the bottom, the zigitai in the middle, the thranitai at the top, had to move as a single body, each stroke timed to the one before and the one beside. The whole ship a machine of coordinated human effort. When it worked, and it worked because these men had learned to make it work, a trireme could accelerate from stillness to ramming speed in a few ship lengths. This was earned pay for hard, skilled work, and the men who did it knew their worth. A writer we know as the old oligarch, a sharp and irritated critic of the democracy who set down his thoughts sometime around 424 BC, put the complaint plainly. He observed that the democracy was resilient and hard to overturn precisely because the men who manned the ships had genuine power, and they knew it. The city could not feed itself without them. Athens imported most of its grain, much of it carried down through the Hellespont from the Black Sea regions to the north, and the fleet that held that route open was rowed by thete hands. Take the poor citizen off his bench, and the city's grain supply failed. The old oligarch did not mean this as praise. He found it outrageous that the lowest class of citizens commanded such leverage. But the very sharpness of his grievance confirms the picture. The thete rower was not a passive recipient of the democracy's generosity. He was one of its load-bearing members. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. His days on land had a plainness to them. He woke at first light, as the whole city did, when the streets were still cool and the smell of baking bread from the nearest oven drifted down the alley. He ate a small morning meal, a handful of barley cake perhaps, with olives and water. His house was rented, its walls of mud brick on a stone base, its few windows facing the courtyard rather than the street. A burglar wanting to enter would not bother with the door. Athenians called that kind of thief a wall digger, a toikorinchus, because the soft mud brick yielded more easily than any lock. There was not much inside worth taking anyway. He went to the agora when he had business there, to buy the day's food or to see if there was work. He attended the assembly on the appointed days, making his way up to the Nix, the rocky outcropping west of the Acropolis, and finding a place among the thousands of men who gathered in the open air to decide the city's affairs. He raised his hand on a vote. He listened to speeches. He shouted his approval or displeasure. His voice was one among thousands, but it was not a smaller voice than the one beside it. This was the thing that the old oligarch could not reconcile himself to. Not simply that the poor had influence, but that the poor man's vote and the rich man's vote were worth the same. Both counted, both final, neither one carrying more weight because of the land or the silver behind it. The thete survived in that space, between the enslaved and the propertied, on a narrow margin that war and plague and a bad sailing season could narrow further still. But he was free, and he was Athenian, and in a world that sorted human beings into legal categories as precisely as it sorted grain by quality. Those two facts together were worth more than almost anything money could buy him. One step up from the thete's rented room and the 3 obol daily wage, the city's ladder arrived at a man who owned land. Enough of it. A man whose property, assessed in the old way, placed him in Solon's 3rd class, the zeugatai, the yokemen, and who could therefore do something the thete could not. He could equip himself for war. What made a man a hoplite was not blood or title. It was armour. The panoply, the full set of equipment that a citizen soldier was expected to bring to war at his own expense, was the entry fee into a world that Athens mythologized, even as it was slowly changing. A bronze helmet, heavy enough that after a long march in the August heat, a man felt the weight of it in his neck and shoulders. Greaves of shaped bronze, fitted close over the shin, snapping into place around the calf. A breastplate, hammered bronze in the earlier style, or in the classical period, often a linothorax, layers of linen pressed and glued together until they stiffened to a hardness that could turn a spear point. A secondary sword for close quarters, short and broad. A spear, the dory, ashwood and iron tipped, roughly 2 to 2.5 meters long, the rear end finished with a bronze spike that could serve as a weapon if the shaft broke. And the shield, the aspis, the great round thing, roughly a meter across, its face covered in bronze, its inner surface fitted with a bronze armband through which the forearm passed and a grip for the hand. It weighed perhaps 8 or 9 kilograms. Carrying it on a summer march was not a casual burden. The full panoply together cost 30 drachmas or more, a figure that varied by decade and by the quality of the craftsman, but consistently enough that it represented something close to a month's wages for a skilled worker. A man saved for it. He inherited it if he was fortunate. He maintained it, cleaning the bronze against corrosion, replacing a broken haft, keeping the lining of the helmet from rotting. A battered aspis that had been to 2 campaigns carried its history in its dents, and a man who polished it in the autumn light was touching his father's war. To afford this, a man needed land, a small holding, a few hectares at most, growing barley as the staple because barley was hardier than wheat on Attica's thin rocky soil and cheaper. Olive trees running along a terrace, established over years, producing a harvest every other season that could be pressed and stored and sold. Grapevines, a kitchen garden of onions and garlic and beans. Perhaps 1 or 2 enslaved workers helping with the heavier labour, ploughing, threshing, carrying, without whom the farm demanded more than a single family's hands could give. His year followed the land's rhythm, ploughing and sowing in the autumn after the first rains had softened the ground baked hard by summer. A winter of quieter work, pruning, repairing tools, mending fences. The spring's green olive blossom, the grain turning gold through May, the harvest in June, cut by hand under a sky already committed to heat, threshed on the stone floor. And then the summer, which was also, inconveniently, the fighting season. Athenian armies campaigned in the summer months, when roads were passable and water was where you expected to find it, and the enemy's standing grain was ripe enough to threaten with fire. A citizen hoplite answered the summons, strapped on his panoply, took his spear, and marched out with his neighbours. He carried a few days' rations and received whatever daily allowance the state provided on longer campaigns. He went. He stood in the phalanx. He came home when the fighting was done and returned to his fields in time for what remained of the season. War was a disruption to the farming year, not a replacement for it, and the men who stood beside him were the same men whose fields bordered his, whose children he had watched grow, whose opinions he had heard at the assembly. The phalanx made that neighbourliness into something structural. Hoplites stood in close formation, shields overlapping, each man's aspis extending slightly to the right, which meant that it covered not only his own left side, but the exposed right side of the man standing to his left. The formation held as long as each man held his place. It broke when someone did not, and this meant that a man's courage in battle was not simply a private virtue, it was a debt to the man beside him. To step back was to open a gap in the shield wall and expose his neighbour to a spear. The moral force of that, the way the phalanx converted individual fear into a communal risk, was one of the things that kept the formation together, perhaps as much as any order from above. Conservative Athenians admired the hoplite in the way that people admire a thing they think is disappearing. He was self-sufficient. He asked nothing of the treasury. He stood on his own land, fought with his own equipment, and returned to his own farm when the campaign was over. The opposite of the thete rower who took state wages and whose influence in the assembly rose with every generation of naval campaigns. Much of the political anxiety that runs through the 4th century, the debates about who should really govern, what the right kind of citizen looks like, runs along this seam between the self-equipping farmer and the man who was paid by the city to exist as a citizen. The hoplite was not naive about his situation. His olive trees could be cut down by a Spartan army in an afternoon, and olives took 20 years to grow back. His panoply was the household's largest asset after the land itself. He knew that the walls that protected Attica and the fleet that held the grain routes open were things he needed, even if the thetes who rode the fleet unsettled the political balance he would have preferred. He needed the city more than he liked to admit, and the city, in its turn, needed him, his armour, his willingness to stand in line and push, his quarterly presence at the assembly, his tax in goods and service when the emergency levies came. He was the man the democracy most liked to imagine itself as, even as the realities of empire and silver slowly shifted power away from the land and toward the sea. In the autumn, after the campaign, he hung his aspes on the wall of the men's room of his house, the Andron, and ate a better supper than the thete had managed through most of the summer. And somewhere in the house, in the women's quarters above or at the back, his wife had kept everything intact while he was gone. That is not a sentimental observation, it is an economic one. The citizen woman managed the household, and in Athens the household was not simply a domestic space. It was a producing unit, an economic entity, the foundation beneath everything the citizen man did in the public world. She was the person who made the hoplite's absence possible, and she did so in ways that the city's political life had collectively chosen not to acknowledge, count, or record. Her legal situation was clear and without ambiguity. From her birth until her death, a citizen woman lived under the guardianship of a male relative, her kyrios. In childhood, her father held that role. At marriage, it passed to her husband. If she outlived him, the guardianship fell to a male relative. Her father-in-law, if he lived, a brother, in some cases an adult son. She could not make a significant contract in her own name. She could not bring a lawsuit or appear in court as a full legal person. She could not vote in the assembly, sit on a jury, or hold any office. In the architecture of Athenian law, she occupied a position that was in certain respects similar to that of a minor, present, protected in limited ways, but not a full and independent agent. Inside the oikos, the reality was different in texture, though not different in the direction of power. The household was her domain. Xenophon, writing his Oikonomicus in the 4th century, describes the relationship between husband and wife as a kind of partnership. With distinct spheres, the husband moved in the outer world, the agora, the fields, the assembly, the courts, and the wife governed the inner one. The stores of grain, oil, dried figs, and salted fish, the wool that came in from the sheep, the enslaved women who worked the household under her direction. The daily accounts, not written down necessarily, but held in her head, in the knowledge of what each jar contained and when it would need to be replenished, and what it would cost to replenish it. Xenophon compares her to a queen bee, the one who stays at the centre and organizes everything, while the workers move in and out of the hive. The comparison was meant as praise. It was also a precise description of function. She wove. This requires saying slowly because it is easy to hear and miss. Spinning wool and weaving cloth was not an ornamental activity or a way of filling time. It was essential, productive labour. The household's clothing, the chitons worn daily, the heavier himation thrown over the shoulders against the evening cool, came largely from wool that the women of the house had carded, spun into thread on a drop spindle, and worked on the upright loom. The loom stood in the interior of the house, a constant presence, its rhythm of warp and weft as regular as the seasons. A woman's tools, the wool basket, the spindle, the loom itself, appeared on grave markers, on painted pottery, in the household shrines. They were the emblems of female virtue, not because they were humble, but because they were central. The cloth a family wore was cloth that had been made inside that household, by those hands. It was economic production as direct and real as the grain pressed from the field or the olives taken to the press. The ideal of seclusion, keeping a respectable woman inside, away from the eyes of unrelated men, was most fully realized in wealthier households. A woman of a prosperous family was expected to remain in the gynaeconitis, the women's quarters, often located on the upper floor or in the back of the house, separated from the rooms where men received guests. Pericles, in a remark reported by Thucydides, said that the best woman was the one spoken of least, whether in praise or in blame. She was to be present in the city's life as a function, not as a face. Poverty made this impossible for most women. A thete's wife could not afford to stay home. She sold vegetables in the market. She worked as a wet nurse for families who could pay her. She laboured at harvest time alongside men who were not her relatives, because there was no other way to get the work done. Seclusion was a status marker as much as a moral requirement, a luxury available to those who could afford the enslaved staff that made it unnecessary for the wife to go out. Girls married young, typically around 14 or 15, to men who were often in their late 20s or early 30s. The age difference was wide and was considered ordinary. A young woman was thought to be at a stage of life well suited to being formed by a new household, to adapting to a husband's ways. She was rarely consulted. The match was arranged by her kyrios, her father or male guardian, negotiated with the father or guardian of the prospective husband, sealed with the agreement of a dowry. The dowry, the pruar, was property, money, goods, sometimes a share of land, that the bride brought with her from her natal household into her new one. Her husband managed it. He could use its income, invest it, deploy it in the household economy. But it did not simply become his, absorbed and gone. If the marriage ended, by his death, by divorce, The dowry had to be returned to her or to her family. This was not always a smooth or easy process, and the law courts of Athens heard many cases that involved disputes over dowry repayment. But the principle held. The pra was a reserve, a form of financial security in a situation that offered her few others. A woman of good family with a substantial dowry had a quiet economic weight in her marriage that her legal status did not otherwise give her. And then there was the one place in the city's public life where none of this exclusion applied, where the citizen woman stood not at the margin but at the centre, where her presence was not tolerated but required. The priestess of Athena Polias, the goddess in her role as protector of the city, Athena enthroned on the Acropolis, was among the most honoured persons in Athens. She performed rites that men could not perform. She tended the ancient olive wood statue of the goddess in the Erechtheion, the sacred structure on the northern edge of the Acropolis rock. She held authority confirmed not by custom alone, but by the formal religious structures of the city. Women served as priestesses across many of Athens' sacred precincts, managing cult finances, performing essential rituals, maintaining spaces that were as much a part of the city's infrastructure as its fountains or its law courts. The Thesmophoria was the women's festival, held each autumn in honour of Demeter, the goddess of grain, and of the earth's fertility. For 3 days, citizen women gathered separately from men, organising and performing the rituals themselves. Men supported the festival logistically and were excluded from it. The women elected their own officials for its duration. They managed the sacred proceedings without male oversight. It was, for those 3 days, entirely theirs, and the city did not merely permit this. It depended on it. Athens' understanding of its own continuity, its harvest, its population, its survival from year to year, ran through Demeter's goodwill, and Demeter required the Thesmophoria, and the Thesmophoria required the women. This was not a peripheral or honorary role, it was a load-bearing function of the city's sacred life. There was, at the edge of this picture, another kind of woman's existence, one that the categories above could not quite contain. The heterae were educated companion courtesans who moved in the world of the symposium, the male drinking party that was the heart of elite sociability in Athens. They were not citizen wives. They were not governed by the pra or the kyrios in the way a citizen woman was. They were educated, often substantially more so than women of citizen families, who received no formal schooling. They could discuss philosophy and rhetoric and politics. They had a presence in the intellectual world of the city that respectable women were structurally barred from entering. The most famous, or the most often discussed of them, was Aspasia. She came from Miletus, on the Ionian coast. She was the companion of Pericles himself, the person through whom much of classical Athens was governed. And she is described in ancient sources as a woman of remarkable intelligence and speech. Socrates is said to have visited her. She appears in Aristophanes' comedies as a figure of controversial influence, which, in that genre, was not necessarily a compliment, but was certainly an acknowledgement. She and Pericles lived as partners, and the son she bore him ran directly into the wall of the citizenship law Pericles himself had passed in 451 BC. A child born to a non-citizen mother could not be a citizen. A law that the lawmaker himself had to navigate within his own household. Aspasia stands at the edge of the frame this video draws, not quite inside any of the categories it has traced. And that is precisely why she is worth a moment's attention. She represents the narrow and exceptional space that existed at the margin of the citizen world. a space where a woman of exceptional circumstance could find something resembling the public presence that the city's structures had systematically withheld from the women inside them. The citizen wife's world, and the world of most of the women in Attica, was the oikos, the loom that never stopped. The storeroom counted each morning. The children raised in a household whose public face belonged entirely to someone else. The priesthood at the Thesmophoria, where for 3 days in autumn the city acknowledged what it otherwise preferred not to say plainly, that the women who ran its households and tended its sacred fires were not simply background to the democracy, but part of the structure that held it upright. She could not vote. She could not speak in court. She could not hold office, sign a contract, or appear in the assembly. And yet, without her, the hoplites' farm would have failed in his absence. The household stores would have run out before the campaign ended. The children who were the city's next generation would not have been fed and kept and taught. The silver drachma passed through her hands every morning when she sent the household's enslaved worker to the agora for the day's provisions. She counted it, she allocated it, she knew what it would buy and what it would not. But the city whose silver it was had decided she was not a part of the calculation. From that invisibility and from the household's quiet economy, the coin moved outward again, into the agora, into the courts, into the stone lottery machine on the hillside where the names of ordinary men were drawn by chance, and the city was governed by whoever the lot produced. And so you step out of the household, out of the quiet economy of the oikos, and you walk toward the sound the city makes in the morning, the low, accumulated murmur of several thousand people who have all arrived at the same open space at roughly the same hour. Because the open space is the city's centre, and the city's centre is where everything happens at once. The agora. It lay northwest of the Acropolis, a broad, irregular space of beaten earth and colonnaded buildings, and it was not one thing, but all things at the same time. On one side, a magistrate was hearing a preliminary complaint. On another, a potter had laid out his wares on a cloth. A fish seller's stall was already drawing a crowd, the catch still wet from the boats that had come in at first light from Piraeus. A perfume merchant sat under a canvas awning, and beside him a seller of honey, and beside him a man with a cart full of dried figs from somewhere in the Attic countryside. Children dodged between the legs of men arguing. A dog moved steadily along the edge of the stalls, hoping for something dropped or overlooked. And there, at low wooden tables arranged in a row near the centre, sat the men who made the city's money work. They were almost certainly metics. The money changers of Athens, the men who tested coins, weighed them, exchanged one city's silver for another's, and sat at the intersection of every commercial transaction that passed through the agora, were called trapezetai. From the Greek word for table, trapeza, the table where they worked gave the world, eventually, its word for bank. They tested the silver owls of Athens against the coins of Corinth and Aegina and Cyzicus and a dozen other cities, tapping the coins on stone and listening to the ring, checking the weight on small scales, looking for the telltale dullness of a coin that was lead underneath its silver skin. The Athenian owl was the most trusted coin in the Mediterranean world. On one face, Athena's helmeted head, her eye drawn in the old frontal style, even when the rest of the figure had gone profile. A small archaism, retained, probably, because it had always been there. On the other, the owl, small and still and serious, with an olive sprig and a crescent moon beside it, and the letters of the city's name in abbreviated form. These tetradrachmae, 4 drachma pieces, went everywhere. They have been found in Egypt and in the Levant, and in the deep interior of Anatolia and along the coasts of the Black Sea. A merchant in Memphis who had never seen Athens would have recognized the owl and accepted it. The coin's reliability was not enforced, it was earned. The denominations were simple enough to hold in the mind. 6 obols made 1 drachma, 100 drachmas made 1 mina, and 60 minas made 1 talent. That last number, 1 talent, was not an everyday figure. It was the cost of equipping a warship for a campaign season, give or take. It was a fortune, the kind of sum that changed a man's life, and the scale at which the city thought about serious expenditures. The obol at the other end was what you could spend on a small handful of olives, or what a day's jury service put in your pocket. Jury pay, 3 obols a day, half a drachma, was Pericles' invention, introduced sometime around the middle of the 5th century. Before that, jury service was technically open to all citizens, but practically skewed toward those who could afford to spend a day away from work without payment. Pericles changed the calculation. 3 obols was not lavish, it was roughly what a man might earn doing a day's unskilled labour, but it was enough to make the journey from a farm in the Attic countryside worthwhile. It was enough to bring the old man to the jury who could not otherwise have taken the day. And so the courts filled with exactly the kind of citizens the democracy claimed to represent. Ordinary, not wealthy, not prominent, not anyone a speechwriter would have been tempted to address as men of distinction. The juries themselves were large enough to seem almost impractical until you understood the logic. A jury of 201 citizens, or 401, or 501, the odd number avoiding a tie, was not assembled because Athenian courts were inefficient. It was assembled because a jury that large could not be bribed. No one had enough silver to reach 201 citizens without word getting out. The size was the corruption proofing. And these citizens were not legal professionals. They had no formal training in law. They were simply men whose names had come up that morning in the lottery, who had walked to the court building, been handed a metoikion, their personal bronze identity token, and been assigned a jury by the drawing of lots. The machine that chose them deserves a slow moment of attention because it is one of the strangest and most honest mechanisms any democracy has ever built. It was called the kleroterion, and it was made of stone, a tall rectangular slab with columns of narrow slots cut into its face. Enough slots to hold the bronze pinakia of several hundred citizens. Beside the slots, a vertical tube ran from top to bottom of the machine. Into this tube went a mixture of black and white balls, more black than white, so that most slots would be rejected, and only the ones opposite a white ball would be drawn. The machine did not know who anyone was. It did not care whether you were eloquent or ignorant, wealthy or poor, well-connected or entirely unknown. It read no letters of recommendation. The ball that fell down the tube was bronze and did not have opinions. If your pinakion was opposite a white ball, you were on the jury today. If it was black, you went home. This was the Athenian understanding of equality made physical. Not that every citizen was equally capable, but that the only alternative, choosing by merit or by reputation or by election, would inevitably favour those who were already known, already respected, already rich enough to have cultivated a public image. The lot said, "We do not trust our own judgment about which of us is best suited to govern. We trust the balls. And we trust that the city, over time, run by thousands of ordinary citizens, each serving their brief turns, will make better decisions than any small group of permanently powerful men ever could." The Council of 500 operated by the same principle. 500 citizens, 50 from each of the 10 tribes into which the democracy had organized Athenian civic life. Chosen by lot each year to be the bowl, the working council that prepared business for the assembly, received foreign ambassadors, oversaw the finances, and managed the daily machinery of the state. No one could serve on the council more than twice in a lifetime. Across the arc of a long life, a significant fraction of Athenian citizens would sit for a year in the round council building called the tholos, eating their meals there at public expense when on duty, sleeping there on a rotating basis so that someone from the council was always on call for emergencies. The city governed itself through the accumulated ordinary judgment of thousands of men, each serving briefly and then stepping back into private life, carrying whatever they had learned about running a city into their farms and workshops and dining rooms. The assembly met on the Pericles, a low rocky hill just west of the Acropolis, about 40 times in a year. The meeting place was a stone auditorium cut into the hillside, the speaker's platform, the bema, carved from the rock itself, looking out over rows of standing and sitting citizens. Any adult male citizen could come. Any adult male citizen could speak if he chose to mount the bema and address the crowd. A quorum of 6,000 was required for certain of the most important decisions, votes on ostracism, votes that affected individual citizens' rights, and the 6,000 were not always easy to gather, which is why the state eventually began paying citizens to attend. The pay for assembly attendance began at 3 obols and at some point was raised higher. The details shifted over the decades. But the principle was constant. Poverty was not to be a barrier to the democracy's operation. If you needed to be paid to show up, you would be paid. Ostracism was the assembly's sharpest edge and its strangest ritual. Once a year, if the assembly voted to hold one, every citizen who came could scratch a name on a fragment of broken pottery, an ostrakon, a shard, the cheapest and most available surface in a city full of fired clay, and deposit it in an urn. If 6,000 or more votes were cast in total, and if one man's name appeared more often than any other, that man was given 10 days to put his affairs in order, and then he left Athens for 10 years. Not in disgrace, not in poverty, he kept his property and his citizenship, but in exile, removed from the city's political life for a decade because enough of his fellow citizens had decided he was becoming too powerful, too prominent, too likely to become the kind of single dominant figure the democracy had been built to prevent. Thousands of those scratched sherds have been found by archaeologists in the Athenian agora, centuries after the hands that scratched them turned to dust. The names are still legible. Themistocles was ostracized. Aristides, called the Just, was ostracized. One batch of ostraka found in a well bore the same name written in a small number of different handwriting styles, as if a group of men had pre-prepared sherds to distribute to citizens who could not write. A pre-packaged vote in a supposedly pure direct democracy. People, even then. Quick reminder, after years of lying awake with a racing mind, deep sleep finally became possible. Now learning comes easier, energy is real, and the mind stays sharp. Sleeping like a baby changed everything. If you want the exact system that made this possible, check the link in the pinned comments. The agora, then, held all of this at once, the fish and the philosophy and the money tables and the law courts and the casual politics of citizens who had voted that morning and were now arguing about it over a cup of diluted wine at a stall near the painted colonnade. Socrates walked here. He did not lecture formally. He stopped people, asked them what they meant by courage or by piety, or by justice, and waited patiently while they discovered they were not quite sure. He was an agora figure, not a classroom figure. The agora's noise and commerce and litigation and gossip was his natural element. The same element where the owl coins changed hands, and the fish scales dripped, and the bronze balls fell through the kleroterion's tube, and ordinary men became, for a day, the judges of their neighbours. The silver that moved through all of this, across the money tables, into the jury payers' hands, out to the stalls, came from somewhere. And the city knew perfectly well that it could not run on the silver it already had. It needed a mechanism for making its wealthiest citizens contribute more than just their votes. That mechanism was the liturgy. The word comes from the Greek for work for the people, leiaturia, and it was not a charitable donation. It was closer to a legal obligation, though a curiously flexible and honour-laden one. The wealthiest men in Athens, citizens and, when wealthy enough, metics, were assigned specific public duties from a list and required to fund them from their own pockets, not to oversee the spending of city money. Their own money. Their own talent-full strongboxes. The two great liturgies were the choregia and the triarchia. The choregia was the assignment of funding and training a chorus for the dramatic and choral festivals, the city Dionysia, where the great tragedies were performed, the Lenaea, the Thargelia. A wealthy choregus hired the chorus, paid for their costumes and training and the flute player and everything else a production required, and if the chorus won its competition, he received a stone victory monument that he could set up in his own name on the Street of Tripods near the theatre. The tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides were staged at rich men's expense. Every word of those plays was heard because someone had calculated whether he could afford the production and decided, or been told, that he could. The triarchia was more expensive and more demanding. A triarch was assigned a trireme, a specific ship owned by the state, for a year. He was expected to equip it, maintain it, pay for hull repairs, hire a crew if the state did not provide one fully, and often to command it personally. The cost of a triarchy could reach a talent or beyond. A talent was 60 minas, a mina was 100 drachmas, a drachma was a day's skilled wage. The arithmetic is quiet and significant. A man assigned to a triarchy in a hard year of war was not being asked for spare change. He was being asked for what might represent years of accumulated surplus spent in a single campaigning season on a ship full of rowers whose pay he might be supplementing from his own reserves. And yet men competed for the honour of it. They equipped their ships with painted hulls and polished fittings, and rowers they had trained with care, because a well-run trireme was a public reputation. And a public reputation was worth something in the law courts and the assembly and every other arena of Athenian civic life where you would eventually need your neighbour's goodwill. The system was not naive about human motivation. It did not expect generosity for its own sake. It arranged things so that the same pride and competitive instinct that, in other societies, built private monuments and hoarded private wealth, here built ships and choruses instead. The vanity served the city. There was even a procedure for challenging the assignment. If a citizen believed that another man was wealthier than he was, and therefore better positioned to bear the liturgy, he could invoke the antidosis, the exchange. He challenged the wealthier man either to take over the liturgy himself or to exchange all of his property with the challenger. Every piece of it, the house, the land, the silver, the enslaved workers, everything, If the challenged man truly was poorer, he would take the exchange, and the challenger would discover he had been wrong. If he was in fact wealthier, he would take the liturgy rather than trade his fortune away. The procedure forced the wealthy to police each other because no one was more interested in accurately identifying who had the most money than the man who might otherwise have to pay the bill himself. In wartime emergencies, when the liturgy system was insufficient, the state levied the aisphora, a direct property tax on the wealthy, collected when Athens needed to fund a campaign beyond the ordinary means. And at the other end of the economic scale, the theoric fund, less clearly attested in its origins, but functioning at least by the later 4th century, paid a small sum to citizens so that they could afford entry to the great festivals. The logic ran in both directions. The rich were pressed to contribute more than their vote. The poor were subsidized to participate in the civic and religious life that their vote theoretically guaranteed. The silver moved, always, from where it had accumulated toward where the city needed it to go. But the city's greatest need was always military, and military command was the one thing Athens would not leave to the lottery. Among all the hundreds of offices that the cleriterion filled each year by chance, the archons who gave their names to the year, the commissioners of weights and measures, the controllers of the market, the road builders, the harbour masters, the members of the council, there was a small category set apart, filled not by lot, but by election. And the most important of these elected offices was the strategia, the office of general. 10 generals, one from each of the 10 tribes, the stratgoi, were elected each year by the full assembly by a direct vote of citizens raising their hands on the nix. They alone among the major officials of the democracy were eligible to be re-elected without limit, year after year, for as long as the assembly continued to choose them. And this exception was not a flaw in the system. It was an acknowledgement of something the Athenians understood with considerable pragmatic clarity, that military and financial competence was not evenly distributed by lot, and that the fleet and the army, which were the things keeping Athens alive, could not be handed each year to whoever the bronze balls happened to produce. So the democracy built a small elected ladder inside itself, a man who wanted to lead in any real sense, who wanted to direct foreign policy, manage war finances, command armies in the field, had to stand for election as strategos. He had to persuade the assembly every single year that he was still the right man. Not once, at the beginning of a career, and then permanently installed. Every year, which meant that the most powerful man in Athens was, in the end, more accountable to ordinary citizens than any hereditary aristocrat or appointed official had ever been. He could be voted out. And he knew it. Pericles understood this better than almost anyone. He held the strategia, by later tradition, for roughly 15 consecutive years, through the middle of the 5th century. Building the walls and the Parthenon and the empire and the policy of cautious war with Sparta. He was not a king, he held no hereditary title. What he held was a persuasive intelligence and the confidence of the assembly, renewed annually at the ballot, and a clear-eyed understanding that his power was real only so long as that confidence held. Thucydides, measuring him with his usual cool precision, wrote that Athens under Pericles was in name a democracy, but in fact the rule of the first man. Which was true, and not quite as cynical as it sounds, because the first man's position rested not on birth or force, but on the sustained, renewable consent of the men who voted for him each spring. The accountability mechanism extended to the end of every official's year in office. The euthena was the accounting, a formal review of conduct and finances that every official, including generals, underwent when they stepped down. Citizens could bring complaints before a board of examiners. A strategos who had mismanaged money or lost a battle through negligence or acted corruptly could be fined, exiled, or brought to trial before one of the large popular juries. The power to command did not exempt you from the power of the people's judgment. It made you more subject to it, because more had been entrusted to you. In 406 BC, that accountability became something darker and more terrible. At the sea battle of Aegian, off the coast of Anatolia, the Athenian fleet won a significant victory over the Spartans. But afterward, in rough weather, the commanders failed to rescue survivors and recover the bodies of the Athenian dead from the water. The survivors who made it home brought the news, and the assembly's grief and fury at the abandonment of the dead turned into a trial. Several of the victorious generals were tried together in a single mass proceeding that itself may have violated the legal norms the democracy was supposed to uphold. They were convicted. They were executed. Men who had just won a battle for Athens, put to death by the same city they had served. The demos was sovereign, and the demos, in that moment, did not feel like wisdom. Socrates, who happened to be serving that day as a member of the presiding committee of the council, reportedly refused to put the irregular collective vote to the question, one man's objection alone, in the machinery of democratic fury. He was overruled. The generals died. It is a reminder that the lottery machine and the election and the great jury and the assembly were made of people, not of principles, and that people, even in a democracy, are capable of the kind of decision that a later and quieter moment will regret. The strategos, then, was the top of the pyramid, and the pyramid was not what it first appeared to be. It was not a hierarchy of birth, where a man's rank was fixed at the moment of his first breath, and the only way up was through a door that had been locked before he arrived. It was something stranger and more complicated, a machine that granted radical equality to a specific and limited group of men, that filled most of its offices by lot from that group, that paid the poorest of them to participate, that forced the richest of them to fund the public goods the rest could not afford, and that held its one concession to elected competence, the general accountable each year to the show of hands of the men he commanded. And the machine ran on silver. Follow the coin from the beginning. It started underground, in a gallery at Laurion so low that the man swinging the pick had to lie on his side to reach the vein. It was lead ore, galena, fractured from the rock face in the light of a small clay lamp, carried up through the narrow shaft on the backs of workers who had no name that the historical record chose to keep. The lead was smelted in the furnaces on the hillside, and the silver was drawn out of it by cupellation, by blowing air over the molten metal until the lead burned away, and the silver beaded and cooled into a disk. That disk travelled to the mint at Athens, where it was struck between two dies into the owl tetradrachm that circulated from Egypt to the Black Sea. Then it moved. A metic money changer at his trapeza in the agora tested it against coins from other cities, accepted it at the weight his scale confirmed, and passed it on. A thete rower received it, or perhaps 3 obols of it, at the end of a week's rowing on a trireme that had been built for the city's use and was ploughing through the Aegean to keep the grain route open. He spent some of it on barley at the agora, a little on saltfish, and carried the rest home to the shared room in Piraeus, where he slept between campaigns. A hoplite farmer, returned from the summer's campaign, spent his own drachmas on the oil to polish his bronze greaves and on the barley seed he needed to plant before the rains came. A citizen woman, her husband's courier over the household's accounts, counted obols in the storeroom and decided what could be bought and what would wait. A rich citizen, assessed for a liturgy, counted out a talent into a chest and sent it to the dockyard where his trireme was being fitted for sea. And at the end of that chain, a strategos stood on the nix and made the case for his re-election to the men whose votes he needed, the same men whose oars kept the empire running, the same men who had been chosen by lot to judge his conduct at the Euthina. He was elected. He sailed. The trireme his liturgy-paying neighbour had equipped moved through the water on the arms of the thetes who had been paid their 3 obols the previous season, and the city's power, its grain supply, its silver revenue, its continued existence as a free state moved with them. The Athenians did not think of this as a contradiction. The democracy and the slavery and the exclusion of women and the exclusion of metics were not, in their minds, in tension with each other. They were the same system. The freedom of the citizen was not in spite of the unfreedom of the enslaved. It was, in some material sense, because of it. The silver that came up from the mines at Laurion, dug by Andropoda, who had no standing in court and could be chained and sold, was the same silver that paid the jurors 3 obols, funded the general's fleet, and built the Parthenon above the city that housed it all. The Athenians saw this clearly enough. They simply did not find it troubling. They were the citizens. The rest were the rest. We have followed it now, the full descent and ascent of the pyramid. We stood at the bottom of a gallery in Laurion with a clay lamp guttering and a pick in hands that history forgot to name. We walked into the household where the paidagogos waited at the door and the enslaved woman ground the grain in the kitchen while the children slept. We paid our 12 drachmas of metoikion and sat at the trapeza and tested the silver with the practised hand of a man who was free and prosperous and permanently excluded. We took our 3 obols for rowing and felt the oars pull in our shoulders and the salt on our lips. We polished the bronze shield and marched out in a line with our neighbours and came home to the barley harvest. We managed the storeroom and counted the provisions and sent the household out into a city where we could not follow on equal terms. We drew our token from the cleriterian slot and walked into the jury to judge our neighbour. We paid a talent for a trireme and found, the following year, that the expenditure had won us more friends in court than any speech could have. We stood on the nix and voted for the man who would command us, and then stood in the same place the following year and decided whether to keep him. The city they made, brilliant and brutal and loud and unjust and genuinely, structurally equal among its chosen few, endured for long enough to produce the plays and the philosophy and the history and the law and the democratic instinct that would travel forward, imperfectly, into every subsequent attempt to organize a government around the idea that ordinary people, chosen by chance, can be trusted to govern themselves. They could. They could also be wrong, in the way that only a democracy can be wrong, loudly, collectively, and without a single person to blame. If this gentle walk through the levels of ancient Athens has been a companion for your evening, if you found yourself drifting through the agora, or feeling the weight of a bronze shield, or watching the balls fall through the cleriterian's tube, then perhaps you might consider subscribing or leaving a quiet thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. There will be another video waiting for you when this one ends. You can simply let it play. Let the next one come to you. You do not have to go looking for anything tonight. We followed the silver from its beginning. We watched it change hands across the world the Athenians built over the broken rock at Laurion. We sat in the winter sun of the Pnyx and heard the arguments. We walked the dusty paths between the stalls of the agora. We stood at the water's edge at Piraeus and watched the triremes move out through the channel toward the open sea. We followed the coin all the way to the general's hand and back again to the treasury, and in the tracing of its passage we traced the whole strange shape of a city that believed, with complete sincerity, that it had invented freedom. Now let that world go quiet, let it settle, the way dust settles in an empty agora after the stalls have been folded and the voices have gone home. Let your jaw unclench, gently, all the way. Let your shoulders drop from wherever they have drifted. Feel your breathing find its own pace, slower than you have been breathing for most of the day. Easier, without effort. The gallery at Laurion is dark. The assembly has risen from the Pnyx. The owls on the coins are still. The cleriterion stands empty in the night, its slots holding no one's name until morning. Nothing left to do now but be calm and drift.